Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. If you've been watching this channel, you've probably heard me say something like, I prepare problems, not solutions for my players. In this video, we're going to talk about preparation. How I prep, what I like to prep, what I find fun to prep, and what I find useful to prep in my game. When I'm playing, I'm playing. So as someone running a campaign, a referee, a dungeon master, game master, there's kind of two types of play that we have. There is the play at the table in your weekly or bi-weekly or whatever game where you're with your group and you're going on adventures, as it would be, refereeing the adventures. And then there's the private time, right? The prep, if you will, the creating NPCs, the drawing maps, world building, that kind of stuff. And you're also playing there. If I'm choosing which type of play I like better, I prefer the play when I'm at the table with my friends. So I want to create a system, or have created a system, where I don't need to do so much of the other. That's not to say that can't be fun. And a lot of times we like world building, and I think this is interesting because the topic will come up and people will say, well, I love world building, so I love prep. I don't know that world building and prep are exactly the same. I think that thinking about the world that your characters are playing in, creating like large sweeping ideas, is different than getting monster stats together, balancing encounters, figuring out plot points if you're going to do something that's a little bit more narrative. That is a little bit more kind of down in, focused in, zoomed in, if you will. And that's the stuff that I'm not going to do personally myself very much in my campaign. For me, I like to kind of go with the flow. That is to say, in order to try to run it as freewheeling and player agency heavy as possible, I'm going to say overplan, and I know overplan can be controversial. We'll see what you say in the comments below. But I try not to overly think about what the players might do, unless they tell me specifically they're going to do something, and if there's specifically a set piece I need to create. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But generally speaking, for me, the prep that I do is really just what I normally do in life to kind of fill my brain, if you will, or my imagination with ideas. That is to say, I read books, I read comic books, I play some games, video games occasionally. Getting into that a little bit more, so maybe we'll talk more about that later. And I watch movies. I also watch some YouTube videos. And what I get is this swirling mass in my head of ideas. My experience with life, my experience with people, my experience in reading fiction gives me an idea of what the world that I'm running for my players is like and what will happen. I can't remember if it was KR. I was having a conversation, or maybe I was watching a YouTube video. Does it ever feel like you're having a conversation when you're watching somebody's YouTube video? Anyways, and they're talking about the idea that like some people think, oh, you got to know everything because the players might ask a question like, what is that guy's job, or what is this? And that's just kind of silly to me. I think that if the players want to know what a random NPC's job is, and if that random NPC is not relevant to the story, it's really going to depend on the situation, right? If you just walk up to somebody in the street and say, hey, what's your job? They might tell you. They might think you're kind of weird, especially if you're approaching them and you're clearly an adventurer covered in weapons. They might just be like, gotta go. So you don't need to have all that information. Just think about how somebody would react to something. If you walk into a tavern and you go up to a bar and you walk up to the bartender and you go, who's that guy in the corner? Do you think they're just going to go, oh, that's, and then read off the person's history? Of course not. At the most, they might know the person's name, or they might have an idea and be like, oh, I think they work down at the docks. And for that, you should be able to, knowing your world, knowing the tropes in your world, be able to decide that. Is this bar full of people that work down at the docks? Is it where the royal people come to eat, right? Where are they in the world? Who might likely be in this place? And who might not, if you want to add a twist? And this kind of, you've got to get a feel for it, at least in my opinion. You've got to sit there and say, if things are kind of going along, there's not much happening, and they walk into a tavern and you want to get something going, you can think to yourself, well, I know that this tavern is mostly filled with roughnecks, but I'm going to put somebody here that seems out of place. And that's it. That's all you really need to know, because if you have an idea that, oh, there's a richer quarter over here with the merchants are, or there's royalty, or this is happening, because you already know that about your world, you can just place that person right there, right then. And it's easy enough to do, and it makes sense. Now, you could say that this might be kind of forcing a plot point or something, but you don't need to put them in, have them get up and walk up to the player characters and say, help me. You can just place them in the bar. And if the player characters start asking around, they might stumble upon them. They might look at it and go, that person seems incredibly out of place. We're not going near them. They might go over and talk to them. That's up to them, right? And knowing your world and your players knowing your world, which will happen as they continue through the adventuring, they'll get an idea of whether or not that person should be there or not. Or maybe that's when they ask the barkeep, knowing what they'll do. Just to reiterate here, I think that the idea of knowing your setting and knowing what people will generally do is really the key. If you have that idea, then you will be able to navigate most of the what they call social situations in your world. And also that includes going down into the dungeon in the wilderness. If you know that there are bandits in this area that are robbing people and the player characters are going down the path on their horses with all their piles of gold, well, it's likely the bandits are going to rob them, right? If you know that there's wars going on in this area or certain types of factions don't like each other, that might create issues, right? So let's say the orcs and the goblins are battling in this forest and the player characters are going down the trail and they encounter orcs. You'll have an idea that these orcs don't like the goblins. They might immediately think, if you roll a hostile reaction, that the player characters are with the goblins. They might also think, well, we've got to fight goblins. We don't want to mess with these heavily armed adventurers, and they might hide or follow them. They might actually ask the player characters if they've seen goblins. All these things can be factored in based on a reaction roll. You don't have to pre-plan that and say there's orcs in the forest, and if they encounter the player characters, you can roll randomly orcs. You know what orcs are doing. You can roll randomly a reaction. You can see how the orcs feel about the player characters. Then it just becomes, how do the player characters interact with the orcs? That's where the story goes. That's the emergence of the story. You don't have to have planned that. All you need is maybe a few random encounter tables, knowing your world enough to know who in this area is friendly with who else, and go for it. Breaking the tropes. Let's get back to that tavern scene. So here we are in this tavern, a rough tavern on the docks, right, where maybe the player characters are there looking for some henchmen. And now you want to break the trope by having somebody there that's maybe doesn't fit in. But isn't that also a trope, right? Isn't the kind of royal prince that wants to be tougher goes down there and shows off their money and hangs out with the wrong type of people? That's also a trope, right? So we can actually play this up with the game, right? It's not even breaking it, really. There might be somebody there for that reason. Now, they might also be there because they are gambling, another trope. They owe somebody money, another trope. They're planning on an assassination, another trope. So what's the most likely thing for you? What's happening in this world? What seems exciting? What would draw your players in? This is the kind of stuff we want to put in the world around them so that they'll be connected to it. And you just get a sense from your players what they're interested in. And, it's also kind of fun sometimes to break the tropes by having something like, let's say, I hate to say it, but if we put a princess in there instead and they're dressed in finery, the player characters are more likely to think they might be in trouble. Let's turn that trope on the head. Maybe she's the one looking for an assassin. Maybe she's the one gambling, right? We can do that, right? Just because typically the trope would be the royal prince does that, why can't the princess do it? And we can really mess around with the idea there. What do I prep? Saying that I just watch a lot of movies and read a lot of books isn't maybe enough to say what I actually prep. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of what I do prep, what my notebook looks like, if you will. And I've seen people do notebooks where they draw out the maps and very specifically and all the stats. I generally don't do that. What I do is I put down NPCs that are in the general area that the PCs are in, and usually we're in my campaign, they're on islands. So usually think people on that island, main NPCs, I'll put their name, roughly what their jam is, if you will, right? So are they chaotic? Are they kind of a merchant? Are they benevolent? I'll put a quick stat next to them. And I just do that I usually use the level title because I am playing OD&D. So I'll put like swashbuckler, right? Or something like that. And that's all I need. I don't need anything else. If I want to seed them with a magic item, or if I know specifically they're going to get played that session, then I might add a few more details. But that's all I need. I need to know that there's some people over in this kingdom and they're ruled by a prince who is a a superhero, let's say, and then if the players ask about it, I think to myself, well, they're a superhero. That's an 8th level player character. What have they done? Right? You already know. As I'm saying that, in your head, you're thinking, oh, well, they're 8th level. They've probably slain a dragon, or they did this, or they fought that, or they were in a war. You can just make that up on the spot. Just make sure you keep good notes. You don't need to sit at home and make that up. Why does it matter that you made it up at home 3 days before the adventure and not just on the spot? Do what seems natural. People lean into tropes. What I said before about breaking the tropes earlier, you do that once in a while. If you always break the tropes, then your characters don't know what to expect. Then you lean into gonzo territory. If you're into that, that's fine. But if you want things to make sense and have the players make informed decisions, you've got to basically keep things in the way that they expect them to be, right? The superhero prince has done a bunch of stuff, right? The superhero princess that rides a dragon she's riding a dragon, right? So what does she do? She's awesome, right? And we know this. And that's easy enough to say. She's called the Dragon Rider. Why is she called the Dragon Rider? Well, she rides a dragon, or maybe not. Maybe she slayed a dragon, right? And again, you can play around with this. But the idea is that I take NPCs in wide strokes. That's it. For my dungeons, when I create them, generally speaking, that's a whole separate thing where I will create a wandering monster. We've talked about creating individual adventures before, but those I kind of create when I have a moment and I just have them sitting around. I create a dungeon when I feel like it, and when the player characters get close to it, we play it out. I think about what's going on. I stock the dungeon with monsters and I move forward. But what if I have to do that on the fly? What do I do when the player characters go someplace I haven't prepared for? Tools at the table. Right now, my campaign is kind of more of a politic-y campaign. That is to say, they're higher level. So they're most likely encountering NPCs and kingdoms and things in the wilderness, and less likely to run into things that are in the underworld, except I have a very specific underworld thing that's already pre-built. So forgetting about that for a second, what do I do? What do I use at the table? Well, I use the rule books, number one. So I use the wandering monsters and such from OD&D, and I just use those rules, and I use reactions, and I use my knowledge of the world. Beyond that, I have a few oracles I use. If you've watched my actual play channel, you've seen I use something called Rolling the Bones from Tales of Argosa, and also their deck of signs. So those two oracles are just fantastic. Tales of Argosa is really cool. I actually did a video about it, but haven't really dug in and played a lot of it, but I've used those two oracles to death, and they're fantastic. I use them in my actual play all the time, so if you want to watch that, my solo game. Beyond that, I also sometimes use what's called the Game Master's Apprentice deck. It's got lots of names and kind of locations on it that I use to kind of randomly generate that kind of stuff. Beyond that, I have in my bag, in my 3-ring binder, I've printed out several Dyson logos maps. Dyson is amazing. They put all these maps out there, and both commercially and just for your table use, and they're just wonderful. A lot of times they'll have histories and backgrounds and stuff. I don't use any of that. I just print the maps out, and I have a few towers, a couple of small dungeons, and 1 or 2 bigger dungeons. And what I'll do is if they encounter a space that I need a map for, I'll just pull one out and use it. And then once I do that, I mark it up. The other thing I've used quite a bit, and I haven't used it in a while because we're doing less dungeon crawling, is from the people that do Morkborg. There's something called Dungeon. I think it's Dungeon, D, but it's got no vowels, so it's like DNG. I'll see if I can find a link to it, but it creates basically rooms, if you will, in a dungeon. No map. It just kind of has ideas. It'll be like filled with ooze that's gross or whatever, And I sometimes will use that just to fill the space quickly with things that are interesting if I don't have an idea. And for monsters, I just use the monsters from the game. I think about what's logical here. I roll, if they run into a dungeon system, I'll usually just roll a monster and then say, okay, this is this monster's lair, and that'll be the primary monster there if I haven't prepared something else. For treasure, I just use the random treasure. It's simple enough. The game works for it. The advantage of using OD&D really is that it's so simple and it really just works well. The same thing with BX. If you just use the treasure tables that are there, you use the monsters that are there, it will work. Will it always make sense narratively? Not necessarily. So that's where you have to kind of inject what makes sense in your world, right? If you roll orcs and there's no reason why orcs would be here because you're in the Elfwood, you either have to say, why is there an orc lair in the Elfwood? Or you have to say, that doesn't make any sense, and I'm just going to go with something else. What makes sense to be here? And there you go. I would probably say, it's been long since abandoned, and then they've come up through the underworld and now they're reoccupying it again. The elves don't know about it yet, right? And again, that would make sense in my world, because the elves aren't necessarily patrolling their woods, because elves in the elf wood are pretty confident that nobody's messing with them. So orcs coming up through the ground in the middle of it is exactly the kind of thing that would catch the elves by surprise, right? So this would work in my world. That might be completely weird in your world, and you might say, no, that's no way that's going to happen. Just put something appropriate there. If you need, you could always just put some kind of more animalistic thing, or something corrupted, right? Pick an animal and roll elks, and then go, you know what? This layer is basically, this elk has been corrupted by something in the water, and now we've got this monster, and I'm going to use the owlbear stats. And there you go. But basically, you can kind of do this on the fly, and you don't need to have prepared an entire idea, especially if they're just kind of coming upon it in a hex crawl. Notes. The final thing I want to touch on here is notes. The key to kind of playing when you're playing, as opposed to prepping, is to keep really good notes while you're playing. I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before, but normally what I'll do is I'll make very basic notes as I'm playing. So I'm not going, hold on, let me write up a whole thing here. I'll write prince, in the tavern, gambling, right? That kind of thing. Then what happened with the player characters. Then after the game is over, I will look at my notes and I'll fill in any extra blanks so I remember what actually happened. And also I'll flesh it out more. So if they just barely interacted with them and the prince is in debt and the player characters help them get out of the bar and now they're on the run, and then the session ends, I can say, okay, so let's see, who's the big boss here? Who do they owe? What can we do? And that's the kind of prep that I'll be thinking about before I play the next time. And again, I'm thinking about it in my head, and I might pull up my book and write down a couple of notes, but I'm not sitting down for an hour or two ahead of time making up an entire plot, because I like to do that at the table with my friends. I'd love to know what kind of prep you do, if you kind of do like I do and you play when you're playing, or if you do lots of prep ahead of time. Do you consider world building prep in that way? How do you create NPCs? How much detail do you go into? Do you create relationship maps and draw lines left and right? Or do you kind of just go with what feels natural in the moment? I would love to hear what you have to say, and whether you have tried different techniques. Let me know in the comments below. Check the description. You'll find a link to my Discord server. We could talk about this even more over there. And also a link to my Patreon. I'll talk to you soon.